A Western intelligence official tells NBC News Russia tonight has 112 to 120,000 troops on Ukraine's borders in 60 battalion tactical groups, with more, maybe many more, on the way.
For weeks now, together with our allies and partners, my administration has engaged in non-stop diplomacy.
Tonight, tensions are sky high as Moscow moves ever closer to setting off a war that Joe Biden and U.S. allies have spent weeks trying to prevent.
And breaking right now overseas, President Vladimir Putin addressing Russians on national TV there, saying he'll be recognizing two Kremlin-controlled separatist regions in Ukraine, effectively blowing up diplomatic efforts to resolve this crisis.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
And this is why I never cover current events. So, as you've probably seen in the news lately, there's a lot of talk about Russia and Ukraine. I'm not going to be talking too much about the current situation, largely because things are changing on the ground faster than I could possibly make a video about it, and so that's going to not be addressed. So I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, at Putin's expansionist foreign policy and the neo-Russian empire.
Standing by for an Oval Office address by President Bush, as he contributes to a day even historians may have trouble describing. A day when Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of a Soviet Union which had already ceased to exist.
Now to the fighting between Russia and Georgia over the Georgian breakaway region of South Ossetia. President Bush has told Russian leaders that military action against Georgia is unacceptable. Russia's invasion must not go unanswered.
Chaos in Kyrgyzstan as protesters seize a police van. They slam it through the gate of the central government headquarters in Bishkek.
Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. В связи с этим ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Мы точно знаем, нам не нужна война, не холодная, не горячая, не гибридная. Но если на нас будут наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей, мы будем защищаться.
One of the driving forces of Russian history has been fear of invasion. During the medieval period, the Russians faced invasions from numerous nomadic hordes, the Huns, Mongols, and the Tatars. The princes of the various city-states vied for power, with one being given the title of Grand Prince. Eventually, the Russians were able to start fighting back, with the hordes falling into infighting and the various Muscovite states being unified under the rule of Grand Prince Ivan III, later known as the First Tsar. The primary goal of all the succeeding leaders of Russia, czars, general secretaries, and presidents, has been to protect the Russian state by territorial expansion, putting as much physical distance between the seat of power and those whom they see as threats. And no matter how much the geopolitical landscape changes, Russian leaders always retain this fear. Every instance of opposition to the Russian state, foreign or domestic, is seen as a threat to the security and sovereignty of the state. And occasional invasions have been the greatest kindling for this fear. The First World War, the Allied intervention, and the Second World War made the Soviet Union even more paranoid of Western infiltration than the US was over communist infiltration. McCarthyism had nothing on Stalin's purges. This fear is also reignited during political collapses. After the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the first thing all the attempted successors did, Kerensky, the Whites, and the Bolsheviks, was attempt to reassemble the empire and rein in the non-Russian nationalities. And the same has been happening in post-Soviet Russia as well, but on a slower timetable. The fall of the Berlin Wall triggered the most recent collapse, first letting Warsaw Pact nations escape from behind the Iron Curtain, followed by member states of the Soviet Union itself. And like that, Russia suddenly feels exposed. Even Boris Yeltsin, who played a pivotal role in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, attempted to secure Russia's territorial buffers by creating the Commonwealth of Independent States, a regional organization consisting of numerous former Soviet states. The membership of it has changed over time, but this institution has been preserved under succeeding Russian leaders as vital to their national security. Not only did Yeltsin have to deal with perceived external threats to its security, but internal as well. The Chechens and other Islamic ethnicities in the Caucasus tried to separate from the Russian Federation, which the Kremlin put down in a drawn-out, brutal conflict. Yeltsin also had the internal threat of the oligarchs and massive corruption carried over from the old Soviet bureaucracy. Watch this previous video to learn more about that. By the time Putin came to office in December 1999, Russia felt weakened and internally insecure. Putin's ascent to power was initially greeted with optimism by outsiders. The incompetence and corruption of the Yeltsin regime was over, Putin cracked down on the oligarchs, and President Bush had a positive relationship with Russia's new leader.
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
After 9/11, he cooperated with the United States during the invasion of Afghanistan, allowing the US to deliver supplies from the north through Russian territory. The US was also getting more involved in the region as a whole, building and leasing air bases in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, as well as sending economic aid to the other Central Asian countries in hopes of circumventing potential Islamist takeovers. Putin seemed especially on the US side in the war on terror after the Beslan siege, when Chechen Islamists took a primary school hostage in 2004 and killed over 300 people, a majority of which were children. But things began to go awry a year earlier. When you hear 2003, you're probably thinking about the Iraq War, and although Russia did oppose the US invasion, the subsequent rise in energy prices were to Russia's benefit. The real shift came down in the Caucasus. In Georgia, one of the former Soviet republics, there was popular discontent with the political elites, who were mixes of incompetent and corrupt, and election results were frequently fraudulent. Parliamentary elections were held on November 2nd, in which foreign observers from Europe and the United States found the declared results had been tampered with. One of the opposition candidates, Mikhail Saakashvili, who had been denied a victory by said election fraud, led a group of protesters to storm the parliament, with roses in hand, interrupting a speech by President Eduard Shevardnadze, who fled the chamber with bodyguards. He called in the military and police to put down the protests, but they refused. On November 23rd, Shevardnadze resigned, and Mikhail Saakashvili would become president of Georgia in 2004. Later that year, the results of a presidential election in Ukraine were in dispute. The post-Soviet situation of Ukraine was similar to that of Georgia, but the political elites of Ukraine weren't just corrupt, they were also in the pockets of Russian oligarchs and the Kremlin. The first round of the election brought the race down to just two candidates, a pro-Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, and the pro-Western MP, Viktor Yushchenko. The results of the second round declared that Yanukovych had won, but foreign election observers found fraud in the vote counting, which led the Supreme Court of Ukraine to order a redo of the second round. This time, with strict adherence to election rules, Viktor Yushchenko was declared the winner with 55% of the vote. We see similar events unfold in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. Parliamentary elections in February had a strong showing for President Askar Akayev, but foreign election watchers called out election fraud, which triggered protests around the country. But unlike the prior two revolutions, the violence escalated. On March 3rd, a bomb went off in the apartment of an opposition leader, Rosa Otunbayeva. The Akayev government denied responsibility. A week later, another opposition leader, Kurmanbek Bakiev, led a protest in the capital, where he and 22 members of parliament held a symbolic vote of no confidence. Protests began to spread across the country, where they began to occupy government buildings, demanding Akayev resign. Armed police began removing their uniforms and joining the protesters. The opposition leaders met on March 22nd and began forming their own interim government. On March 24th, the Supreme Court of Kyrgyzstan recognized the interim government as the legitimate administration. Kurmanbek Bakiev was made prime minister, while Akayev and his family fled to Russia, resigning from office on April 3rd. Bakiev was made acting president and eventually was elected fully president. Protests would also erupt in September 2005 in Belarus against the policies of its president, Alexander Lukashenko. Opponents of the regime had a tendency of disappearing, which most suspected were orchestrated by the regime. Protesters had adopted denim clothing as their symbol of resistance, which goes back to the Soviet era, in which jeans were seen as support for Western-style liberal democracy. Belarus would see their own election-related protests in March 2006. The first days of the protests saw their max participation at around 10,000, but as the days continued, their numbers continued to shrink until there were only about 200, mostly young protesters left, when, on March 23rd, Lukashenko sent in riot police to disperse those remaining. The protests perked back up again on March 25th, with 45,000 demonstrating across Belarus. They would clash with the police, and one of Lukashenko's electoral opponents, Alexander Kozulin, would be arrested and sentenced to prison for 5 years. This, in the minds of the Kremlin, seemed to stem the tide of what's been called the color revolutions. Putin's government would go on to blame all the protests on the United States, and label them as CIA-backed coups. This is an important point needed to understand the current situation in Ukraine, but we'll get back to that later. Putin would shift into a more aggressive foreign policy to counteract this perceived encroachment on its near abroad, with its first intervention addressing where the color revolutions started. Although the impetus for the Russian invasion of Georgia was triggered by the Rose Revolution, the foundations of the conflict started earlier. The borders of modern Georgia were drawn during the Soviet period. Most ethnic Georgians lived within its borders, but two non-Georgian populations were kept within, the Abkhazian ethnic group in the northwest and the Ossetian ethnic group in the north, both bordering the Russian SSR. Stalin drew the administrative boundaries of the Soviet Union with the intent of fomenting ethnic conflict. If all the Soviet republics were busy pacifying internal conflicts, then they wouldn't have the resources or resolve to challenge the central authority of Moscow. You can see these lines in the Caucasus and Central Asia. If he had wanted, Stalin could have carved out these areas as their own republics or added them as autonomous regions of Russia, but he didn't. Instead, he placed them within Georgia's borders. Abkhazia had been a full-blown autonomous republic, while the South Ossetians had been semi-autonomous. After the attempted Red Army coup in August 1991, the member states of the Soviet Union began to declare their independence, including Georgia. After declaring its independence from the USSR, Georgia also abolished the autonomous status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This was followed by riots and resistance in both regions. A nascent Georgian military clashed with local militias, who were backed by units from the Red Army that were stranded in the country after it declared independence. As fighting between Georgians and the autonomous regions continued, Abkhazia declared independence, and South Ossetians held a plebiscite in which they voted to join Russia, neither of which were acknowledged by Georgia. Abkhazia began an ethnic cleansing campaign, driving out a majority of ethnic Georgians living within Abkhazia. Under Boris Yeltsin, Russia negotiated a ceasefire between Georgia and the separatist groups. Georgia agreed to recognize Abkhazia's autonomous status within Georgia, but not South Ossetia. As part of the ceasefire agreement, Russia sent troops into Abkhazia and South Ossetia to serve as peacekeepers. Despite the ceasefire agreements, there would be occasional flare-ups between the sides over the next 15 years. Under Putin, the Russian military in South Ossetia and Abkhazia began arming and training local militias. They even granted the inhabitants of Abkhazia Russian citizenship and allowed Russian intelligence services to operate freely in the territory. Both sides would engage in military exercises, each becoming increasingly provocative over the course of the 2000s. From July 15 to 31, 2008, Georgia participated in a joint exercise with NATO, and Russia had completed one of its own on August 2nd. At this time, Russia also began sending a military convoy to one of the roads connecting South Ossetia to Russian North Ossetia. For several days after, South Ossetian militias began firing artillery at Georgian villages, to which Georgia responded. But on August 7th, President Saakashvili ordered a unilateral ceasefire, to which South Ossetian militias responded by firing on Georgian civilians again. Saakashvili decided to order a stronger response with an airstrike on the South Ossetian capital, Tsiskinvali, which killed some Russian peacekeepers. Russia used this as an excuse to invade Georgia, but not just South Ossetia or Abkhazia. They used these regions as jumping-off points to invade the rest of Georgia, nearly reaching its capital of Tbilisi. By the end of August, Russia granted diplomatic recognition to Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent nations. But in reality, they are just Russian-backed mafia puppet states. Putin would also begin reasserting influence in Central Asia. In 2010, the lease on an airbase in Kyrgyzstan, which had been rented to the United States, was up for renewal. and President Bakiyev began a bidding war between Russia and the United States. The US was willing to pay more for the base and thus regain the lease, but at a higher price than before. In April of that year, unrest hit the capital, but to this day we don't know exactly what caused it. The Russians blamed radical Islamists angered by the US presence in Kyrgyzstan, but many have accused the Kremlin of fomenting revolution in order to oust Bakiyev because he didn't obey Putin's demand of not leasing the airbase to the US. Behind the scenes, the Obama administration negotiated the safe escape for Bakiyev and his family out of the country. New elections would be held in December 2011, which brought the pro-Russian Almazbek Atambayev into the presidency. Under his leadership, the lease on the airbase was not renewed in 2014. Elections in 2010 also brought the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych into power in Ukraine, undoing much of the Orange Revolution of 2005. He and his cronies would continue their corrupt relationship with the Russian oligarchs and the Kremlin. It wasn't enough for Russia to invade and occupy parts of Georgia. Parliamentary elections in 2012 brought the pro-Russian billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili into the prime ministership. Ivanishvili founded the Georgian Dream Party, which had been pro-Russian. He ran for parliament on a platform of replacing Georgia's constitution with one that took power away from the president and placed more in the hands of the prime minister. During his brief tenure, there was a rise in state-endorsed xenophobia, radicalization of the Georgian Orthodox Church, and harassment of religious minorities. He would threaten journalists and had Saakashvili's political allies arrested. He had several statues of Joseph Stalin erected in Georgia, including in Stalin's hometown of Gori, after Saakashvili had them torn down. After Ivanishvili's resignation in 2013, he chose a successor who was mostly his puppet, continuing to guide the country while in formal retirement. Having seemingly reasserted control over its near abroad, Putin began looking to leverage influence outside its immediate periphery. The Arab Spring had destabilized the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Russia's only naval base in the Mediterranean had been leased to it by the Assad regime since the 1970s, continuing on from the Soviet period. On top of this, Russia had ongoing arms sales to the regime. So when the anti-Assad forces began to rise up, along with ISIS, they stepped in to prop up their ally. The Kremlin also began reaching out to extremist political parties outside of Russia to politically destabilize potential geopolitical roadblocks. In Hungary, it supports the Jobbik Party, led by Gábor Vona. As the Jobbik Party has gained more support, Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party has had to move further to the right in order to avoid losing more voters. This has led to closer ties between Orban's government and Russia, who was helping Hungary build nuclear reactors. The Kremlin also forged ties with the National Front in France, led by Marine Le Pen. The party is Eurosceptic and wants to replace the EU and NATO with an exclusively European partnership that includes Russia. Many people affiliated with the National Front also work for Kremlin-funded Russian television networks in France. In the Balkans, the Kremlin has fostered relations with the neo-fascist party Golden Dawn, led by Nikos Makalliakos, who, while in prison, received letters from Alexander Dugin, praising their foreign policy goals and how they line up well with his neo-Eurasian ideology. Now, I had a whole section of this video originally planned to talk about this guy, but at this point in the script, we're already 2,500 words in, and I'm not nearly done yet, so we're gonna have to save that for another time. The Kremlin is also believed to be aiding the Ataka Party in Bulgaria, a far-right nationalist party led by Volan Sidorov. And, of course, I should also mention Russian ties with various figures on the American right. Most of the relationship with these figures are primarily business. Shady business, but it's still mostly business. Their interest in Russian political goals extend no further than it benefits their wallets. Some figures, such as Steve Bannon, have forged ties with European far-right figures, including Alexander Dugin. Since most of the ideological ties between Russia and the American right go through Dugin and Bannon, I'm going to save that for another video. With all of these tendrils infiltrating Western countries, Putin feels safe, but the artifice began to crumble in late 2013. In November, Ukrainian President Yanukovych refused to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. This would have opened up trade between the EU and Ukraine, but it required Ukraine to initiate judicial and democratic reforms, one of which required allowing imprisoned opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko to leave Ukraine to receive medical treatment, which Yanukovych refused, with the parliament agreeing. They tried to offer an alternative agreement, which would settle trade disputes between the EU, Ukraine, and Russia. but the EU observers believed that this decision was being coerced by Moscow. In the following days, protests broke out across the Ukraine, the biggest since the Orange Revolution. On November 26th, the Ukrainian government admitted that Russia had asked it to delay the agreement with the EU. That same day, Vladimir Putin called for the criticisms to stop, and that the EU-Ukraine deal was bad for Russia's interests. Protests continued until the Ukrainian parliament voted Yanukovych out in February 2014. This is where Putin and the Kremlin's perception of the color revolutions comes into play. They perceive all of these revolutions that put pro-Western governments into power as Western-backed coups, meaning that in their eyes they are illegitimate governments. They see them as foreign occupied puppet regimes. Now one could ask, how much does Putin actually believe this? I mean, he's usually portrayed as some kind of mafia don who's cynically holding on to power to ingratiate himself and his cronies. But if that's the case, then why provoke the West like this? If all you wanted was wealth, it would be far more effective to just keep your head down and sell your oil. Instead, he does all these things that result in economic sanctions, which harm the Russian people, and results in his buddies getting their overseas assets frozen. I think there's more to Putin's worldview than cynical self-indulgence. He is, or at least was, a Soviet nationalist, if not a Russian one. In a line quoted by just about everybody looking at his regime over the last decade, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So much of his identity and pride seems to have been wrapped up in being a Soviet, and the fact that the Soviet Union was considered a superpower on par with the much wealthier United States. Some will point to the mafia-style tactics of the regime, but those are nothing new. Tight state control and preferential treatment to backers of the regime was present in the Soviet Union, and it was also present in the Empire of the Tsars. Regardless of whether Putin and the Kremlin are getting high on their own supply, with their puppet in Kyiv gone, Putin has no choice but to activate his trap card, one set by the Tsars and Stalin long ago. I mentioned earlier that during the Soviet period, Stalin redrew the internal borders of the Soviet republics in order to foster ethnic division, but that's not all Putin has to work with. During the era of imperial expansion, the Tsars sent Russians to serve as the governors or administrators of their new territories, serving as the ruling elites. This policy was continued in other forms under Stalin and the Soviets. During new land campaigns, the Soviets would try to open new lands for cultivation, and in doing so, they would recruit ethnic Russians to settle these new lands. This is why there are sizable Russian populations in Kazakhstan or the Baltics. But this policy took a dark turn in Ukraine. I've already made a whole series of videos about this before, so if you want a deeper dive, go ahead and watch those. But here's the short version. During the early 1930s, Stalin committed a mass genocide against the Ukrainians in the form of a man-made famine. He forcibly collectivized farmland in Ukraine, which resulted in people who didn't know how to farm being placed in charge of farms. This was on top of the ever-present issue of communism eliminating personal incentives to work hard. So you had incompetence placed on top of apathy. That would have been bad enough, but the farmers who didn't want to join the collectives, labeled as kulaks, had all of their food taken from them by the state and local party officials to the point of starvation, which resulted in reports of cannibalism from the countryside. This genocide killed between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians and depopulated large swaths of eastern Ukraine, which Stalin proceeded to settle thousands of Russian families on to continue farming the land. The Soviet regime proceeded to cover up the famine with the help of foreign journalists and governments. Watch my Conspiracy of Silence series to learn more. Because of what Stalin did, there is a sizable population of ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine today. These populations of ethnic Russians would become casus belli for any desired intervention into neighboring countries. In late February 2014, protests erupted in the more ethnic Russian provinces of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. On February 27th, masked Russian soldiers without Russian insignia on their uniforms, often referred to as Little Green Men, overthrew the local autonomous government of Crimea. They held a sham vote in the local parliament, with the MPs being forced at gunpoint to vote for Sergei Oskyanov to be their new prime minister. As the head of Crimea, he oversaw a referendum on March 16th, which resulted in Crimea declaring independence from Ukraine and subsequently being annexed by Russia. Prior to the Crimean referendum, the Council of Luhansk Oblast began making moves to separate from the rest of Ukraine. They threatened to call on Russia for protection against their own central government. Pro-Russian citizens began demonstrating in favor of holding their own referendum, like in the Crimea. Busloads of Russian citizens crossed the border into Luhansk in order to support their efforts. Some of them began vandalizing central government buildings, including the local parliament in Kharkiv. Demonstrations began in Donetsk, which shortly after elected a new pro-Russian governor, and the city council voted to hold its own referendum. Eventually, two separatist governments were formed in eastern Ukraine with Russian support. These are the territories that Putin decided to grant diplomatic recognition to, and for which they have invaded Ukraine. Starting in 2014, they began referring to the post-Yanukovych government as an illegitimate puppet state of the West. And in traditional Soviet fashion, they refer to it as a Nazi or fascist state, and accuse it of orchestrating a genocide. And given that the current president of Ukraine is Jewish and his grandfather fought in the Red Army against the Nazis, this is a disgusting accusation. Ukrainian fascist or Ukrainian Nazi are literal Stalinist propaganda lines used to attack Ukrainians who didn't support the Soviets and don't support Russia, and are used to cover up the genocide waged against them. And so, here we are. Russia has invaded Ukraine. People are dying. Things aren't going well for the Russians, but they're probably going worse for the Ukrainians just for the fact that the war is being fought in their country. Normally, at some point in this video, I would give some kind of plug so you could financially support me in making these videos. But instead, if you have the means to do so, I would like to ask for you to donate to help the people of Ukraine in some way. I have a list of charities you can donate to if you want down in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.